I was halfway through my morning coffee when I realized my front gate wouldn't budge. I pushed, I pulled. Nothing. Then I saw it thick, rust-proof chain wrapped around the bars, secured with a padlock big enough to hold down a bank vault. I set my coffee down on the porch railing, shaking my head. There was only one person in this neighborhood unhinged enough to pull something like this: Nancy Caldwell, self-appointed queen of the HOA. Right on cue, she appeared at the end of my driveway, arms crossed, her signature smug expression plastered across her face. Nancy was in her 50s, with a stiff blonde bob and a wardrobe that screamed, power-hungry PTA mom. "You'll find," she called out, voice dripping with fake politeness, "that delinquent homeowners who refuse to pay their dues don't get to enjoy the privileges of this community." I exhaled through my nose, keeping my temper in check. "You chained my gate shut, Nancy." She tilted her head. "You ignored your fines, Isaac. Actions have consequences." I let out a dry laugh. "You can't just lock people onto their property." "Oh, but I can," she chirped. "Our bylaws state that homeowners who fail to comply with HOA regulations can face restrictions on community access." I stared at her, incredulous. "My own driveway is now restricted access," Nancy shrugged. "Until you pay the outstanding dues." Now, here's the thing: there were no outstanding dues. I knew that. She knew that. But Nancy loved control, and I had made the mistake of challenging her at last month's HOA meeting when she tried to push through a ridiculous rule about mandatory lawn gnome placement. I took a slow breath. "You're going to take this chain off." Nancy just gave me that infuriating little smile. "Not until you pay." I ran a hand through my hair. "All right," I said, turning back toward my house. "You want to play games? Let's play." I walked inside, grabbed my phone, and made a call. "Hey, Mark, yeah, it's me. I need you to bring the paperwork." "No, the big one, the property records." Because here's the thing Nancy didn't know: this entire street, the land beneath it, the sidewalks, the utilities, I owned it. And Nancy was about to find out exactly what that meant. Mark pulled up in his truck 20 minutes later, tires crunching against the pavement. He climbed out, a thick folder tucked under his arm, and shot a glance at the chain still securing my gate. His brows lifted in amusement as he whistled low. "Looks like someone's on a power trip," he said, shaking his head. Nancy, who had been lingering near her porch, turned at the sound of his voice. Her eyes narrowed as she marched toward us, her heels clicking against the pavement. "You can't have visitors while you're in violation," she snapped. Mark gave her a slow, deliberate look before turning back to me. "You weren't kidding. She really thinks she can get away with this." I nodded, flipping open the folder he handed me. Inside were the original land deeds, the property zoning documents, and the very contract that would be Nancy's undoing. I pulled out the most relevant page and held it up. "Nancy, do you know what this is?" I asked, my voice calm but firm. She scoffed. "I don't care what kind of nonsense you're trying to pull. Until you settle your dues, you have no authority here." Mark chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. I ignored her attitude and continued. "This is the deed to the land beneath this entire street, including the sidewalks and the access roads leading in and out of the neighborhood." I tapped the paper for emphasis. "Which means that the very ground you're standing on, it belongs to me." Nancy blinked. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. "That's ridiculous." Mark pulled out another document and handed it to me. I held it up so she could see. "This is the HOA establishment contract." I let the weight of the words sink in before continuing. "Your HOA was formed years after this land was originally purchased, and guess what? The HOA has no legal claim over the roads or the sidewalks because they were never included in your jurisdiction." Nancy's mouth opened, then shut. She was clearly scrambling for a response, but I wasn't done. "That means you have no right to fine me for anything related to this property, and it definitely means you have no authority to block access to my own home." Her face turned an interesting shade of red. "That can't be right." Mark pulled out another paper and handed it over. "It's all right here in black and white. You might want to take a long, hard look before you dig yourself into an even deeper hole." Nancy snatched the documents from my hand, scanning them quickly. Her expression shifted from disbelief to something closer to panic. I crossed my arms. Now here's what's going to happen. You're going to remove that chain, immediately. She swallowed hard, but her pride wouldn't let her back down so easily. This is obviously some sort of oversight. I'll have my lawyer review it. I gave her a slow nod. You do that. But in the meantime, consider this. If I wanted to, I could charge the HOA for using my roads. I could make every homeowner here pay me a toll just to drive to their own houses. Nancy's eyes widened. She knew I wasn't bluffing. Mark leaned in slightly. And if you refuse to remove that chain, we'll be calling the police to report unlawful detainment. Because right now, that's exactly what this is. A muscle in her jaw twitched. I could see the gears turning in her head, trying to find a way out of this without admitting defeat. But she had backed herself into a corner, and we both knew it. With a sharp huff, she whirled around and stomped toward her house. Moments later, she re-emerged with a set of keys, muttering under her breath as she unlocked the padlock and yanked the chain free. I stepped forward and pulled my gate open, savoring the moment. See, that wasn't so hard, I said, my tone deliberately light. Nancy glared at me, but for the first time she had nothing to say. Mark clapped a hand on my shoulder. Well, that was entertaining. What's next? I glanced at Nancy, whose expression had darkened considerably. Oh, I think we're just getting started. Nancy stormed away, her rigid posture betraying her frustration as she disappeared into her house. I watched her go, knowing full well she wasn't done scheming. People like her never admitted defeat outright, they just retreated to regroup. Mark leaned against his truck, arms crossed, a slow grin spreading across his face. So, he said, think she's going to back off, or is she going to double down? I exhaled through my nose, watching the curtains in Nancy's window twitch. Oh, she's definitely going to double down. He let out a low chuckle. Then I should probably stick around. I nodded, already thinking ahead. Nancy had been running this HOA like her personal kingdom for years, and now that she'd been publicly humiliated, she would be desperate to reassert control. The problem for her was, I wasn't just some homeowner she could push around. An hour later, I found out exactly how petty she could be. A white HOA truck rolled up to my property, and out stepped two men in polo shirts embroidered with the association's logo. One of them, a lanky guy with a clipboard, made a beeline for my driveway while the other snapped pictures of my front yard. I folded my arms, waiting. Can I help you? The clipboard guy barely glanced at me. Routine HOA inspection. I raised an eyebrow. Routine. The only thing routine about this is how predictable it is. He cleared his throat, flipping through his paperwork. We've received reports of multiple violations on this property. Mark let out a low whistle. Multiple, must be serious. The second guy lowered his camera. Your grass is overgrown by at least an inch past regulation length. Mark choked back a laugh. Oh no, an inch. Clipboard guy pushed his glasses up his nose. And these trash bins not stored properly. I glanced at the bins, neatly placed against the side of my house. They're exactly where the county says they should be. He pursed his lips, flipping to another page. Also, your mailbox is not in compliance with HOA aesthetic standards. I stared at him. It's the same mailbox I've had for 5 years. Mark snorted. Let me guess Nancy sent you. Clipboard guy stiffened. We act independently of the HOA board. I let out a slow breath. And what's the fine for these so-called violations? He hesitated before reading off the paper. $500. Mark let out a low laugh. You've got to be kidding. I didn't laugh. I was done playing along with Nancy's games. Reaching into my folder, I pulled out another document and held it up. This is the legal zoning map that shows where the HOA's authority ends. My property, I tapped the paper, not within your jurisdiction. Which means you have no right to fine me for anything. Clipboard guy glanced at the document, his confidence faltering. That can't be right. Mark leaned in slightly. It's right. And if you issue that fine, you'll be looking at legal repercussions for fraudulent enforcement. The second guy exchanged a look with Clipboard. We should probably check with Nancy. I think you should, I said, my voice even. They hesitated, then hurried back to their truck. Mark exhaled, shaking his head. That was pathetic. I watched them drive off. Nancy's desperate. She knows she's losing control. He crossed his arms. So what's the next move? I glanced toward Nancy's house. She wants to play dirty, fine. Let's see how she handles a real challenge. That night, I made a few calls. If Nancy wanted to misuse the HOA to harass homeowners, I was going to hit back where it hurt. The next morning, I filed an official complaint with the city about the HOA's unauthorized regulatory overreach. Then I sent out copies of my land deeds to every homeowner in the neighborhood, making sure they knew the truth. Nancy had no authority over the roads and had been illegally enforcing rules on properties outside her jurisdiction. By noon, the neighborhood was buzzing. Owners gathered on sidewalks, papers in hand, murmuring to each other. Nancy had ruled through misinformation for years, but now, people were realizing they'd been paying fines they never had to pay. And Nancy, she had no idea what was coming. By the time the sun was high in the sky, the neighborhood was a furnace of whispered conversations and hushed outrage. Homeowners stood in clusters on their driveways, waving copies of the documents I had sent them. Some were flipping through the papers like they were reading their overdue lottery winnings. Others were just shaking their heads in disbelief. The scam Nancy had been running for years was unraveling right in front of her, and there wasn't a thing she could do to stop it. Nancy, however, was nowhere to be seen. That was predictable. She wasn't the type to come out and face the storm when things weren't going her way. She was probably holed up in her house, frantically making calls, trying to find a way to salvage her grip on the community. But there was no salvaging this. People weren't just angry, they felt betrayed. The first person to walk up my driveway was Steve, a retired Air Force mechanic who had been dealing with the HOA's nonsense longer than I had. He had a thick envelope in his hands and a look on his face like he had just been handed the secret to the universe. "So let me get this straight," he said, waving the papers in front of him. "Nancy's been fining us for things she doesn't even have authority over." I nodded. His jaw tightened. "I've been paying these crooks for years. They made me replace my fence twice because it wasn't in compliance, cost me thousands." He exhaled sharply. "And you're telling me they didn't even have the right to enforce that?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you." A woman named Rachel joined us, her face tight with anger. She fined me for painting my front door the wrong shade of blue. I had to pay for a whole new paint job just to avoid more penalties. More neighbors were trickling in, their voices rising as they shared their own experiences: landscaping violations, bogus maintenance fees, even penalties for things that weren't in the HOA's guidelines. Steve glanced toward Nancy's house. "So what's the plan? We just let her keep getting away with this?" I shook my head. "Absolutely not." I pulled out a petition I had drafted that morning, one that called for an immediate financial audit of the HOA's accounts. If Nancy had been this brazen about illegally enforcing rules, who knew what kind of financial mismanagement was happening behind the scenes? Rachel's eyes lit up as she read over the petition. "This is perfect. If we can prove she's been misusing funds, we can push for her removal." Steve grabbed a pen from his pocket and signed his name without hesitation. "She's been bleeding this neighborhood dry for too long." One by one, the neighbors signed. Some were angry, others disbelieving that they had been duped for so long, but all of them were ready to fight back. It wasn't just about the fines anymore. It was about trust that Nancy had shattered with her greed. By the time the petition was full, Nancy's front door finally creaked open. She stepped out, her face carefully composed, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. She had heard everything. She walked toward us, trying to maintain the same air of superiority she always carried, but this time it wasn't working. People weren't intimidated anymore, they were furious. "What is this nonsense?" she demanded, eyeing the petition. Steve turned to her, his voice steady but firm. "It's a petition for an audit of the HOA's accounts." Nancy scoffed, but there was an edge of unease in her tone. "You can't just demand an audit. There are procedures." Rachel cut her off. "We looked up the bylaws. If enough homeowners request it, the HOA is legally required to provide a full financial report." Nancy's lips pressed into a thin line. "This is ridiculous. I have done nothing wrong." I stepped forward, meeting her glare head-on. "Then you shouldn't have anything to hide." The silence stretched between us as the crowd waited for her response. "I won't stand for this kind of insubordination," she finally snapped. You're all being manipulated." Steve let out a sharp laugh. "Manipulated? Lady, we've been manipulated by you for years." Nancy's mask was slipping. She was losing control and she knew it. I took another step closer. "You locked me in my own property, Nancy. You broke the law because you thought you could get away with it." I gestured toward the petition. "But you can't get away with this." Her eyes flickered to the document, then to the faces of the neighbors surrounding her. For the first time, I saw something I had never seen before in Nancy: fear. She turned on her heel and stormed back toward her house, slamming the door behind her. Rachel exhaled. "She's going to fight this." I nodded. "Let her. She's already lost." Because the moment the audit happened, Nancy's entire empire was going to come crashing down. Nancy's door remained shut for the rest of the afternoon, but the neighborhood was alive with movement. People were passing around copies of the petition, knocking on doors and discussing their next steps. The illusion of Nancy's control had shattered, and now that people knew the truth, they weren't going to let her get away with it. By the time the sun dipped below the rooftops, the petition had gathered dozens of signatures well beyond the threshold needed to force the audit. Rachel had taken charge of organizing the paperwork, while Steve had already contacted an independent auditor who specialized in HOA financial investigations. I stood near my driveway, watching as neighbors moved with purpose, their frustration turning into action. Nancy had ruled through intimidation for years, but now she was the one trapped. Mark parked his truck in front of my house and climbed out, shaking his head as he surveyed the activity. "She's not coming out, huh?" he said, glancing toward Nancy's darkened windows. "She knows the second she does, she'll have to answer for everything," I said. "I bet she's on the phone with a lawyer right now trying to find a way to shut this down." "She can try," I said, "but the bylaws are clear. She has no choice but to comply." Rachel approached us, holding the petition folder tightly in her hands. "It's done," she said. "We have more than enough signatures." I already emailed the HOA's official account with the request, along with a certified copy that'll be delivered tomorrow. Mark gave a low whistle. "And when's the audit scheduled?" Steve walked up, rubbing his hands together. 3 days from now." The auditor is a pit bull when it comes to financial fraud. If Nancy's been skimming money or misallocating funds, he'll find it. I nodded. "Good, because I have a feeling there's more going on than just bogus fines." Rachel tightened her grip on the folder. "If she's been misusing funds, we can push to have her removed from the board entirely." Mark crossed his arms. "And if she refuses," Steve's expression hardened, "then we take it to court." No one doubted that Nancy would try to fight back, but this time she didn't have the upper hand. The neighborhood was united against her. The next morning, Nancy finally emerged. She stepped onto her porch wearing a crisp blazer instead of her usual cardigan, her posture stiff as she scanned the street. Her usual smug confidence was gone, replaced with something colder, calculating. Neighbors stopped talking as she walked toward me. Rachel and Steve stood close by, watching. Nancy's voice was clipped. "I received your petition." I kept my expression neutral. "Good." Her lips pressed together. "This is a waste of time. The HOA's finances are in order, and this audit is nothing more than harassment." Steve let out a short laugh. "Harassment? You've been extorting this neighborhood for years." Nancy ignored him and focused on me. "You're making a mistake." I met her gaze evenly. "The only mistake was letting you get away with this for as long as we did." Her fingers curled into fists at her sides. "If you think this little stunt is going to change anything, you're wrong." Rachel stepped forward. "We'll see about that." Nancy's jaw tightened. "Fine, have your audit. But don't be surprised when nothing comes of it." She turned sharply and strode back to her house, the tension in her shoulders betraying her composure. Mark exhaled. "She's rattled." "She should be," I said. "Because once we have proof of what she's done, she won't have a leg to stand on." 3 days later, the auditor arrived. A man in his 60s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, he wasted no time getting to work. Nancy had no choice but to provide access to the HOA's financial records, though she did so with barely concealed contempt. We weren't allowed in the room while he reviewed the documents, but the longer he examined them, the deeper his frown became. Hours passed. Finally, he stepped out of the HOA's office, holding a thick stack of reports. "I'll need to finalize my findings," he said, addressing the gathered homeowners, "but I can already tell you there are serious discrepancies here." Nancy's face went pale. Rachel's eyes narrowed. "How serious?" The auditor adjusted his glasses. "Tens of thousands of dollars in misallocated funds, questionable expenses that don't line up with HOA duties, and a suspicious lack of transparency in where certain payments have been going." The crowd murmured in outrage. Steve's face darkened. "So she's been stealing from us." The auditor didn't confirm or deny it outright. "I'll be submitting my full report to the proper authorities. If criminal activity is involved, this will escalate beyond HOA penalties." Nancy's voice was sharp. "This is a misunderstanding." The auditor didn't even look at her. "That's not for you to decide." Rachel turned to the neighbors. "We need to call for an emergency meeting. Effective immediately, Nancy has to step down." Nancy's composure cracked. "You can't do that," I spoke calmly. "Actually, we can. The bylaws state that if an HOA board member is found to have engaged in financial mismanagement, the homeowners have the right to vote for their removal." Nancy's breath came in short, shallow bursts. "I won't stand for this." Steve crossed his arms. "You don't have a choice." The emergency meeting was scheduled for that evening. Nancy tried everything. She attempted to argue that the audit was biased, that the signatures were invalid, and even that she had been set up. But no one was listening anymore. The vote was cast. Nancy was removed from the HOA board in front of the entire community. Her face was a mask of fury as she stormed out, but it didn't matter. The neighborhood erupted into cheers. For the first time in years, the residents of this street were free from her grip. Mark clapped a hand on my shoulder. "Well, that was satisfying," Rachel grinned. "Justice served," Steve chuckled. "And something tells me this isn't over for Nancy if the authorities get involved." I nodded. "She's going to have bigger problems than an HOA position." As the neighborhood celebrated, I allowed myself a moment to enjoy it. Nancy had spent years controlling this community through fear and manipulation. But now the only thing she had left was the consequences of her own actions. The morning after Nancy was officially removed from the HOA board, the neighborhood felt different. Lighter. People who had avoided each other out of fear of being reported were now chatting on sidewalks. A few homeowners gathered near the community board, where Rachel had posted the official announcement of Nancy's removal. Steve stood nearby, hands on his hips, watching as people read through the document with satisfied nods. Nancy, however, was nowhere to be seen. Her blinds remained tightly shut and her driveway was empty. That didn't mean she was gone. No, she was still in there, licking her wounds, trying to figure out her next move, but there was nothing left to salvage. The HOA had already scheduled a full audit of its finances, and the authorities were reviewing the findings. If criminal charges were coming, and they likely were, Nancy wouldn't be able to bluff her way out of them. Mark pulled up in his truck and stepped out, shaking his head at the sight of the gathered neighbors. He glanced toward Nancy's house, then back at me. "She's still in there," I nodded. "I was half expecting her to pack up and vanish overnight." Steve let out a dry chuckle. "She's too stubborn for that. She's probably trying to convince herself she can still come out on top." Rachel walked up, holding a folder filled with legal documents. "I just got off the phone with the auditor. Turns out Nancy wasn't just collecting fines improperly, she was using HOA funds for personal expenses." Mark's eyebrows shot up. "Like what?" Rachel flipped through the pages. "Luxury spa visits, first-class flights, and a suspicious number of consulting fees paid to companies that don't seem to exist." Steve let out a low whistle. "She was living off our money." I exhaled, watching as more neighbors approached, listening in as Rachel explained the situation. The anger in the crowd was growing, but it wasn't chaotic. It was focused. People weren't just upset, they were ready to make sure this never happened again. Rachel continued, "The HOA is going to press charges. She'll have to answer for everything in court." Mark shook his head. "Does she know yet?" As if on cue, Nancy's front door creaked open. She stepped out slowly, wearing a neatly pressed blouse and slacks, her expression carefully composed. But there was something off about her posture, rigid, hesitant. She had lost control of the neighborhood and she knew it. The gathered homeowners turned to her, but no one spoke. They just watched, waiting. Nancy swallowed hard before finally addressing the group. "This has gone too far," she said, her voice tight. "You're all making a mistake." Rachel didn't even blink. "The only mistake was trusting you." Nancy's fingers twitched at her sides. "I was only ever trying to maintain the integrity of this community." Steve scoffed. "By stealing from us." Her jaw tightened. "Those were necessary expenses," Mark cut in. "Spa treatments were necessary." Nancy's lips pressed together. She wasn't used to being questioned like this, and she was clearly struggling to maintain control of the conversation. I stepped forward. "You're done, Nancy. The HOA is pressing charges. You're going to have to answer for everything." For a moment, she just stared at me, her eyes dark and unreadable. Then, for the first time, her composure cracked. "You don't understand," she said, her voice lower. "I built this community. I made it what it is." Rachel crossed her arms. "You ruled it like a dictator." Nancy's breath came in shallow bursts. "If you go through with this, the HOA will collapse." Steve folded his arms. "Good." Nancy took a step back, her confidence unraveling. "You think you can run this neighborhood without me?" Rachel didn't hesitate. "We don't just think it, we know it." Nancy's gaze darted between the faces of the people she had controlled for years, but there was no sympathy left for her. No fear, just certainty. She exhaled sharply, then turned and stormed back into her house, slamming the door behind her. Mark let out a slow breath. "Well, that was dramatic." Rachel nodded. "She's out of options." Steve smirked. "And soon she'll be out of this neighborhood." The moment Nancy's door shut, the tension in the air lifted. People started talking again, this time with a renewed sense of purpose. Plans were being made how to restructure the HOA, how to ensure transparency moving forward. The neighborhood wasn't just getting rid of Nancy, they were reclaiming their community. Rachel turned to me. "You started this, you know. If you hadn't fought back, we'd still be stuck under her thumb." I shrugged. "I just did what needed to be done." Steve chuckled. "Well, I think I speak for everyone when I say thank you." Mark clapped me on the back. "And to think this all started because she chained your gate shut." I laughed. "Yeah, bad move on her part." As the sun set, the neighborhood felt different, not just free from Nancy's grip, but stronger. United, she had spent years controlling this place through fear. But now she was just another homeowner with no power, no influence, and a long road of consequences ahead of her.